Hi, welcome back to Cartoon Insider.
Okay, you know the name. Well, I don't know why I started to break in with it.
That's fine. You may speak too.
Technically, it's Cartoon Insiders with Doug and Candy.
And I'm Candy.
And I'm Doug.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So today,
what are we talking about today?
we wanted to talk about what the heck a producer is.
Yeah, because we've heard some conflicting.
Didn't you read something online where someone is like, I'm going to clue you all in to what producer means, and then everything was wrong?
Yeah. It was because anyone who tries to define it,
Yeah.
that's where you fail.
You're fighting a losing battle.
Because it is a million things.
It means everything and nothing.
Now, when I first became aware of the term producer, I was in junior high and watching The Producers with Gene Wilder and Zero Mostel.
Yeah.
And so I had it firmly in my head that the producer's the guy who gets the money together to make it happen.
Right.
And then later when I watched The Nanny, that seemed to back it up.
Yeah.
But maybe that's so for live theater productions. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that is not the case in Hollywood.
Or more to the point, it's sometimes the case, but not the majority of the time.
Right.
Like if you get the money together to make a movie, you're going to get called a producer. Like you're going to get a producing title on it.
How often does some guy get the money together to make a movie, though?
Well, I mean, people like put together international financing deals, they wheel and deal and they get money. I mean, there are instances of people getting, even before stuff like Kickstarter, back in the olden days, people just like Ed Wood getting random people to invest in a movie and then make a movie. So that's one of the things that you could do and be called a producer. Yeah.
But that's... I've had people insist to me that my job involved finances. And I was like, are you insane? No one would trust me with their money. What? So, yeah.
You understand accounting, though. You could...
I do. And I mean, I can do all kinds of stuff. I choose not to because I'm very not interested in it.
Yep.
And anything that involves a lot of straight lines and grids is not for me.
I just don't like spreadsheets, but I can do spreadsheets. I can do all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since, and I think I mentioned this before. I think the last show I was on where I was the producer and I actually approved the budget was Dave the Barbarian,
20 some years ago.
20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I can probably do a cartwheel if I have to, but that doesn't mean anyone's going to be paying me to do it. It's just like...
You're not going to be the executive cartwheeler on anything.
I'm not.
So, I mean, I've done stuff where I was involved in the budgeting, but I definitely wasn't gathering money. And I wasn't... I wasn't making final decisions about budget. It was more like I would look at the budget and go, oh, I think we can save a little here, or I think we're going to need more for this, and make recommendations.
But in my experience, the line producer handles anything budget related, like, oh, do we have money in the budget to do this? You turn to the line producer and ask them.
In animation, and they're not always called line producers. Sometimes they're just called producers. And then I think, usually the job immediately below a line producer is production manager, but I think some shows just have a production manager in animation.
Well,
but it's the same. They're doing the same job.
Tim Yoon was Jorge's line producer for a long time, I think.
Yeah.
And then his title got changed to producer because he does so much more than just be a line producer.
Yeah.
He gives input on the story, and I mean, he does all kinds of stuff.
Tim is more involved than people with the title line producer usually are. But I mean, there are no rules, and it's not anything universal. But Tim was always someone who had opinions on stuff and they were good, and so you would ask him about things, and he would get involved. And at some point, it's like, let's just call him a producer because he's making the movie along with us.
And he attended story meetings and
So. And I've worked with line producers who will give creative input, and I've worked with line producers who have ideas for creative input but won't give it because they feel that it's not their place. There are different approaches to it.
Well, sometimes when you're deep in the fantasy realm coming up with the story, it's helpful to get an outside opinion.
Yes.
Because there's just stuff you're not thinking of at some
absolutely.
point.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, we were talking about this before, that thing where it's really easy to forget what is still in the show or the movie. Like, you still remember all the stuff that you cut, and it's hard to keep in your head exactly what's still there. So, it's often super helpful to have someone come in who doesn't remember all the additions and subtractions and cuts and edits and all that stuff, and just can look at what's there and go, you never said this guy's name or whatever.
Right.
That's an example that I see a lot, where people will forget to mention someone's name, or they'll coincidentally cut every line that has the character's name mentioned. Right. And you're just like, who's that?
Right.
And it's one of those things that, like, someone coming in who hasn't been there for everything, and they might be working on the project, but they haven't been there for all the little finessing things. Someone can easily catch that you might miss.
Right. And that's easy to do.
Yeah. Also, I think line producer, I don't know if that's... I feel like it might have slightly different meaning in features usually, but I mean, I think it's substantially the same. But a line producer in an animated TV series is usually, it's a pretty important job. They're keeping everything running. They're often in charge of, like, to some extent in charge of hiring and firing.
And the schedule. And,
like, making sure that, like, people are getting along and stuff's getting done. Yeah, sticking to the schedule, not going over budget. They have a lot of responsibility.
Not just sticking to the schedule, but creating the schedule and scheduling meetings and
Yes. And we've seen this happen where it's hard for us as creative people sometimes to really understand the schedule. Like, I have in the past agreed to schedules and then gone later, like, we're in the middle of it, and I'm like, what did I agree to? It was like, that seemed fine. It was like, no, you got 6 weeks for every episode, but it's like, no, those 6 weeks are overlapping with every other episode, so really you have 1 week per episode.
Yeah, you have to be careful about that. Would you say the line producer is the highest ranking non-creative role on the show?
Yeah, I mean, on shows where they don't have a creative role, probably, on most shows. But then you also have people who are producers who have a producing credit, who work for maybe the studio that's producing the film. So they might not be involved on a day-to-day basis, but they're still getting a producing credit.
Right.
And they might be someone who outranks everyone because they're like a high mucky muck at the studio. But they're not there every day going, what are you doing? Is stuff getting done?
Right.
They have, and they're probably supervising 10 other productions.
Right. And you have, like, the executive in charge of the show who works for the studio, but they're not necessarily called a producer.
Some studios, they will get a producing credit, and others they will not.
Yeah. Some
studios, they get some kind of a credit, and other studios, they get no credit at all. Like, sometimes they're not credited. They're not in the credits for the show. I have no. It seems to be a sort of a studio by studio decision. I don't know how that gets made, but, like, I think when I was at Disney, they didn't typically credit the executives, and then at Warner Brothers they did, I think, and I was like, I don't know why. That's just how it was. But executive producer is what we usually are. We were executive producers on Samurai Rabbit. But, like, on Maya and the Three, we were consulting producers, and it was not super clear. It's never super clear what any of those mean, because every now and then you'll see one that'll be like development producer or something, and it's like, what is that one?
Maybe they were involved in developing the show.
Probably.
And then nothing after that.
They were probably, some places will have, so some studios or streamers will have executives in charge of current programming who work on the show, give notes on the episodes, work on it in production, and then they'll separately have executives in charge of development who just get the show developed, figure out what it's going to be, get it up and running, and then they're done and they move on to the next thing. So they might give someone like that a development producer credit, which would make sense.
Yeah.
But like we were consulting producers on My and the Three, and we were not there through every stage of post.
We were not.
We were not in the edit room. We were not, doing all that stuff. Whereas on Samurai Rabbit, as executive producers, we were
present for everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
We had our fingers in every pie. None of those pies were sanitary.
Yeah. No.
We had fingered every single one. But
don't say that.
Let me rephrase that. There were also people with the executive producer credit on Samurai Rabbit who like worked for the studio or worked for the production entity or whatever, who weren't there, weren't giving notes all the time, but they were important people at the studio. Met.
And then, let me just count here. There are 26 producers on Samurai Rabbit. And I know who 12 of them are.
Okay, so less than half.
Yeah.
You're counting us, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you know who we are.
Yes, yeah. I know who we are. So there are just a lot of people who have some sort of connection to the show that get a credit.
Right. And technically, like, you know who James Wan is.
Yeah, but we never met James Wan.
We haven't met him.
I never received any correspondence from him.
Now, some of these people we may have gotten notes from because the note source wasn't always identified.
Right.
So that's the thing. But the point is, one of the reasons you get a producing title is just because you have some ownership of the property and, you're entitled to a producing title.
Right.
It doesn't say anything about what you did on the show.
Yeah. It's just sort of like, I have a connection, I have a stake in this show, I have some kind of...
You have some ownership, or you have ownership of... You work for a company that has some ownership. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean that they actually, like, worked on the show.
Yeah.
They weren't at the office with a cup of coffee.
But yeah, often people will get a producing credit because they were involved in the early stages of development. Mm-hmm. Which it makes sense when you realize that producer is a very broad term.
Mm-hmm. There could be someone in the office who looks at the scripts or looks at the storyboards or looks at the characters and say, oh, why don't you do that?
Yeah.
And then they get a producing credit.
Yeah.
So it can really just mean so many things.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most... usually the showrunner will have an executive producer credit, but often there will be other people with an executive producer credit. Usually the person who's really in charge of the art and animation, if they're not the executive producer, will be supervising producer. Right. And then usually the person who's handling all the like budget, schedule, hiring, all of that stuff, like the overall in charge of that on the actual production will be a line producer.
Right.
Usually, but none of these rules are rules.
Right. And so, I mean, really when you want to know who's developing the story, who's in charge of the scripts, that kind of thing, often you would say, who's the showrunner?
Yeah.
Because that's the question that you ask.
And that's why showrunner, well, for one thing, is maybe the least creative term for a job.
But also, I don't think there's a showrunner credit anywhere, is there?
It's I've never seen it as a credit. It's not a real job title. It's something that you have to say because if you say executive producer, then you're like the executive producer at the studio or at the streamer or at the overseas animation studio because, some of these shows will have the producers are someone who worked at the animation studio. Like in Samurai Rabbit, some of them worked in India at the studio that did the actual animation. So you can't just say producer, you can't just say executive producer. If you need to know who you have to talk to for like decisions about the show, you say showrunner.
Right.
Because then they're the person who's ultimately on the production, not necessarily at the company, but on the production, they're the person who's in charge.
Yes. I wonder if the microphone is picking up Klaus's snores.
I assume that it is, and I sure hope it is.
Yes.
Can you all hear our dog snoring?
Our little doggy snores. He's got his head resting on his stuffed bunny, and he's laying on his Godzilla blanket.
I want to move the microphone closer to him, but I know I will break something. So.
Oh, and I want to say thank you, everybody. We have already have over 1,000 downloads on our podcast.
Yes, milestone 1 reached.
Yes, so that is like gonna pound my chest. Ooh, that sounds kind of sloppy, doesn't it? It's gross.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone.
Well, we are consulting producers on John Leguizamo Does America.
Yes.
And that involved...
It's the same title as we had on Maya and the Three, but very different job. And that's a live action reality show, so you would expect
it. It was a different thing.
Yeah, it would be different. So, I mean, I think my childhood image of a producer was sort of... Oh, we just saw him in a movie last night, and I can't remember the actor's name, but he was in All About Eve, and he was the producer guy, and he had a Russian accent, and he was like, "You don't by chance have any bicarbonate of soda?"
Yeah.
That guy. When I was a kid, that's what I thought a producer was.
What was the movie we were watching last night? Was it, What Price Hollywood?
What Price Hollywood?
Yeah, there's, on the Criterion Collection channel streamer, there is... it's women writers and pre-code stuff, and we are working our way through that. It is so good.
Yeah, What Price Hollywood is definitely worth watching because it was 1932, I want to say, and apparently basically everything that happens in the movie is just something that happened to someone and they wrote it down. It's all actual Hollywood stuff. And the weird thing is, it comes off like a weird remake of A Star Is Born, but it was before A Star Is Born.
Yeah.
So it's like a pre-make.
Yeah. Did Star Is Born, did it rip it off? Or?
They were both David O. Selznick. They offered...
Inspired by.
Yeah. I think everyone looked at this movie and went like, kind of be better if she married that guy. And then they told that story. And I think there was almost a lawsuit over it. The story was very similar. George Cukor, who directed What Price Hollywood, was offered A Star Is Born, and he was like, I can't do that. It's the same.
Right.
I already did that. And then he did the musical, so he wound up coming back to it anyway. But yeah, it's definitely worth watching for a little slice of 1932 pre-Hays Code stuff.
Yeah.
And hilarious alcoholism.
Oh, God.
Yeah. As is common for that era.
Not quite as much misogyny as I was expecting. However, when he was grabbing the woman by her hair and force feeding her caviar, that did not sit well.
Yeah.
But I was expecting a lot more of that.
And also, the romantic lead was Commissioner Gordon from the old Adam West Batman series, which was just weird because I kept seeing him as Commissioner Gordon, even though he was like 35 years younger.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely worth seeing. And, there's producers in it, so it relates to what we're saying. And in fact, the producer in the movie, what was his name? Something Sachs. He's the same guy who was the producer in All About Eve. With the Russian accent because he was a Russian guy. So. And
he got typecast as a producer.
He really did. Yeah. And I mean, he was playing like the most likable version of the big shot Hollywood producer in that. So often they're depicted as kind of horrible, greedy. I mean, that's sort of the stereotype in a lot of movies. And he was more of a positive character in that. Also, it's worth saying our experiences have been positive. We haven't worked with a bunch of greedy, money-grubbing producers. They've been great. So, but it does bear saying that the title producer is... It's sort of like what you say when you're not sure what to call them.
Right. If there's someone who like made a contribution to the show and you want to acknowledge them, you're like, here's a producer badge you can wear.
Sometimes the post-production supervisor has a producing credit, post-production producer, something like that. It's one of those things where it's like, I've seen people kind of like object to someone getting a producer credit, like, oh, they didn't do enough to deserve that. And it's like,
it's not pie.
But we've already established that producer doesn't mean anything. So how can you say they didn't do enough to be entitled to the credit? And also, as you said, it's not pie. It's not a zero-sum game. We're not going to run out of producer credits.
It's like, I'm less of a producer now.
Yeah. I mean, there were 26 producers on Samurai Rabbit. There could have been 40. You can just keep giving out producer credits. And I mean, famously, there's that joke in, I think it's in State and Maine, the David Mamet movie, where associate producer is just like something, it's a title you give to someone because they like let you film in their barn. It was a joke in the movie. There are people who are associate producers who worked very hard on projects, but the joke in the movie is that it's just something they sort of hand out as a party favor.
Right.
And you know, they get a lot of mileage out of that joke. I love that movie.
You know, I haven't seen that movie in a long time. It feels like it's time to watch that again.
We have to watch it again. I was just saying, I think it is the movie that originated the punchline, so that happened. Because
I remember the first time seeing that, and it was and everyone was talking about it.
Yep, Alec Baldwin. Horrible chain of drunken events leading to a car accident. He pops up out of the car. So that happened. We'd never heard it before. It was the greatest thing ever.
Yeah, and now it's tired.
Now it is a little clammy.
The first time you hear it, it's like, oh,
yeah.
Well, in What Price Hollywood that we watched... that was the first time they did the thing where you see the person's rise through stardom, where you see the marquee outside the theater and their name is really tiny. And then they keep showing it at different theaters and their name gets bigger and bigger until it's huge above the title of the movie.
And
that's
now
the first
it's like,
time that happened.
Yeah, we were like watching it going, oh, they're doing that cliche. And then we read about it and it's like, oh, that was the first time. Yeah. That wasn't a cliche. That was a genius idea that people are still doing.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we called it a cliche, but like, I don't mind it when I see it.
No, I mean, it works.
It's one of the most basic ways of getting information across. It's like the spinning newspaper, which they almost did in that movie. They did like newspaper headline montages, but they never did the newspaper spinning up to camera.
No, it was more like clippings.
Yeah, it was clippings and stacks of newspapers and yeah.
Some of those movies, they're like good, and then you wonder like why have I never heard the name of the lead actress before?
Yeah.
What was her name? Bennett.
Constance Bennett.
Constance Bennett.
Who we've seen in other things, but
stuff,
like
but,
her name never stuck in our heads, and she was a huge star at that time.
Yeah.
I don't know why she's not one of the classic remembered names. I mean, part of it is the name is a little bit. It's a little generic.
Yeah.
A little harder to remember, I think.
And then we watched Working Girls, and the leads in that. It was like I didn't recognize anyone, and yet it was a good movie and popular at the time.
Yeah.
What was the one with the girls' school? The finishing school. Yeah. And Ginger Rogers is in that.
Yes.
Who is my grandmother's cousin?
There you go, Cousin Ginger.
Cousin Ginger.
And she I think that was before she was a big star.
Yeah.
So she had a supporting role in it, but she was great.
Pony.
She played Pony.
Klaus is chewing on himself now.
Eat that foot, Klaus. That's a delicious foot.
So producer can
Yeah.
mean a lot of things.
Yes.
And anytime anyone tells you what a producer does,
Yeah.
be a little skeptical.
Don't listen.
Yeah, just be like, uh-huh. Well, I mean, could you make a movie with your iPad and put it on YouTube and call yourself a producer?
Yeah.
Yes.
And you were the producer.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. I mean, our job title on forums is usually writer-producer.
Yeah, but the descriptive part of it is showrunner.
Yeah.
So
Showrunner is,
Hi,
yeah.
Bobby.
And I mean, the reason that we had to make up that, again, kind of lame name
Hmm.
is because it doesn't mean anything if you say, I need to talk to the producer.
right. Well, you talked about it in your stand-up one time, how it's like
Yeah.
all these, oh, dude, our dog is visually impaired. He has like 25% vision, and he just ran into a table.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard that clonk,
Oh,
but that was
poor
dog
buddy.
face. He's okay.
Well, you talked about how there's these cool names like Grip and Best Boy and stuff. Gaffer.
Yeah.
And then Showrunner.
I mean, it did feel like it was the end of the big naming meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2 minutes to 5, and they just wanted to get out of there. And they're like, "What are we going to call the guy who runs the show?"
A run shower.
A run shower. Okay, showrunner. Done. Ink it.
Watch out.
Should we workshop this a little more? Nah.
It's fine.
Showrunner. I mean, but it's good. You know what people mean when they say that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So next time you're wondering what a producer is, now you know that nobody knows is the answer.
Well, I take a different summation
Yes.
direction.
Okay.
In that just it can mean a lot of different things.
It can.
And if somebody tries to sum it up as if it were
One thing.
definable thing,
Yes.
they are incorrect.
They are mistaken.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's not that it doesn't mean anything. It means a lot of things.
And I mean, to be fair, anytime I've heard someone describing the job of a producer, they're describing the job of some producer.
Some kind of producer.
It's not like they're just making it up. I mean, they knew someone who did a producing job, and that was what they did.
Or they saw an episode of The Nanny. And
Or they
think
saw The
they're
Nanny.
an expert in the field.
They saw What Price Hollywood. Should we tell people to watch all of our fine TV shows and movies?
Yes, watch all of our fine TV shows and movies.
Yeah, go to Netflix and watch Samurai Rabbit, Maya and the Three, and
Puss
A Tale
in
Dark
Boots.
and Grim.
Oh, Puss in Boots isn't on anymore. is
Puss
it?
in Boots, you will have to go to Amazon Prime now.
Oh.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
buy it for money.
Wow.
But please do that. I don't get any of
I
that
was
money.
going to say, we don't get any of that
No,
money.
we don't
but-
get any of that money, but we're still happy to see it happen.
Unless the people are in Europe or somewhere else in the world, and then there are overseas
There's a little bit of-
residuals. So you
yeah.
might get 34 cents if 1 million people watch it.
It's possible, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Alrighty,
Yay.
well, tune into all of our fine projects.
Yes.
And if you want to get a hold of us, what's our Instagram?
Doug and Candy Langdale with underscores in between. So, yeah.
You can find us.
Yeah, we're just right out in the open on Instagram.
Alrighty.
All righty.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.